From the New Arts and Media Studios in Milwaukee, I'm Charles Purcell. This is The Log. A new report confirms that the federal government deliberately targeted Black Lives Matter protesters via heavy-handed criminal prosecutions in an attempt to disrupt and discourage the global movement that swept the nation last summer in the wake of the Minneapolis police killing of George Floyd. Reading now from People's World, prosecutors targeted Black Lives Matter protesters in hopes of disrupting the movement. Movement leaders and experts said the prosecution of protesters over the past year continues a century-long practice by the federal government rooted in structural racism to suppress black social movements via the use of surveillance tactics and other mechanisms. The empirical data and findings in this report largely corroborate what black organizers have long known intellectually, intuitively, and from lived experience about the federal government's disparate policing and prosecution of racial justice protests and related activity, the report stated. The report, which was first shared with the Associated Press, argues that as the uprisings in the summer of 2020 increased, so did police presence, the deployment of federal agents, and prosecution of protesters. The title of the report, Struggle for Power, the Ongoing Persecution of Black Movement by the U.S. Government. It details how policing has been used historically as a major tool to deter black people from engaging in their right to protest and weaken efforts to draw attention to issues impacting black Americans. It also drew a comparison to how the government used counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO, techniques to disrupt the work of the Black Panther Party and other organizations fighting for black liberation. So yeah, this takes an historical perspective. It goes all the way back. And we've seen this over and over and over again. It's not just about maintaining law and order. It's about deliberately suppressing movements, particular segments of the population. It's certainly accepted historical fact now that black folks and anti-war folks were demonized, villainized, surveilled, singled out. I mean, yeah, the United States government does have a responsibility, and folks from my side of the aisle want them to certainly investigate the far right, the Proud Boys, etc., the militias. It's way more than just policing the streets and keeping law and order in the moment. But yeah, it is appropriate to investigate certain movements. But that is a very sort of dangerous thing to do. If indeed these organizations, militias, Proud Boys, far right, the whole, et al., if they are indeed planning violence, if they are planning disruption, if they've got a big cache of ammunition and weaponry, if they are in the midst of planning attacks, absolutely. It's certainly within the purview of federal and state agencies, intelligence, FBI, local police, whatever. Yeah, they should be investigated. We can't just throw a big blanket over this and say, well, just because they're protesters, they're protected. But research has shown clearly, historically, and now we include the summer of 2020, that there were no such plans by Black Lives Matter or the left in general to create havoc, to sow violence. That was just never the case. If you want to investigate that, I guess that's the right thing to do. But let's be honest about what we find in those investigations. And what we find in the current investigations of the far right is that they are the single most dangerous entity that the United States faces right now. Far right violence, and not to mention, and we've talked about this at length, the alliance they have with the Republican Party, especially in state houses, to minimize, to suppress the right of voters, State legislatures are also very interested in and actually enacting into law anti-protest laws. And they get crazy where, okay, you can run down a protester. If they're in the street, you can run them down. That's now legal in some places. So there's this partnership between the extremists and the Republican Party, the illegitimate, fascist, white supremacist, Christian nationalist Republican Party. There's this partnership between the two of them. But time and time again, from the early movements of this, and you could probably take this back, I'm not sure how far they go back historically in this report. Probably go back to the women's suffrage movement as well. Probably go back to abolitionist movements, the Civil War era. I don't know. You probably could. You can certainly, without question, go back to the civil rights era of the 50s and 60s and see through documented evidence clearly that they were being targeted. So-called hippies and Black Panthers, the whole left in general. My God, Martin Luther King, no one got more FBI scrutiny than Martin Luther King. So this is what they do. And this new report, I should say, published in partnership with the Creating Law Enforcement Accountability and Responsibility Clinic at City University of New York School of Law and the Movement for Black Lives. They are calling for amnesty for all protesters involved in nationwide protests. Yeah, and then the right-wing media picks up on it, and even the mainstream media falls for the lies that the summer of 2020 and Black Lives Matter and the left in general in Portland and places like that, anarchists. I hate to use that word because people hear it and they think something that it's not. But the general big lie that these are somehow dangerous organizations, that they're violent organizations. And as we know, they are not. And the more we dig into it, the more we find that's true. You and I have spoken about this many times, how the summer of 2020 was 99.9% non-violent from the legitimate protesters. All violence, virtually all of the violence, came from insurgent troublemakers. It came from the right wing, Proud Boys, etc. at all. It came from the police themselves. So it's a lie. It's just a huge, massive, cynical lie that the left wing, the Occupy movement, Black Lives Matter, the folks in Portland, there's no violence there. It's a lie that there is. No. And not only is it the lie, it's a two-pronged effort here to paint these protesters, to paint the left in colors that are just not true, but also to infiltrate, to surveil, and to suppress the movements themselves. This goes way beyond law and order. This is political oppression, just plain and simple. So if you want to see this report, I'm going to link this article to the Charles Purcell Facebook page, and then the article itself has a link to the actual report. Yeah, we have to be clear. We have to be clear about this. And as I mentioned a couple minutes ago, the right wing might champion this stuff, but the mainstream media picks up on it. And so much of this becomes sort of common wisdom or accepted truth when it's not. Or at the very least, people try to both sides it. You can never, for the love of God, don't give me the both sides argument when you're talking about Black Lives Matter on one side and the far right, alt-right, Proud Boy, 3%er militia types on the other. Or even worse, QAnon and all of that garbage. The far right and the far left in this country cannot be both-sided. There is no equivalence. Now, I'm the first to tell you, I was a little kid. I don't have any firsthand knowledge of this, but my reading of history tells me that, at one time in the 60s, there was a branch of the left wing who had violence in mind. They planted bombs. They were pretty radical. and they accepted violence, and they used it as a tool. I'm not going to say it never happened. Yeah, it did happen. It was never a large movement. It was a fringe of the 60s, 70s counterculture, but it was definitely there. And if you as a government entity, FBI or whoever, if you feel like there's some legitimate danger out there and the powers that be feel it necessary to do some investigating, I'm not going to stop you. That's your job. Go ahead. And if you find that the weathermen of the 60s, to name one example, in the early 70s, if you find they're planning to plant bombs, okay, go get them. I'm a reasonable person. I'm mostly a nonviolent person. I don't want violence. Protest, yes. Love it. Disruption, even? Yes. Civil disobedience? Yes. Violence, never. Never. And then to bring it back to our contemporary times, the both siding again, you want to compare Black Lives protesters to the anti-vaxxers, to the anti-maskers, and to the big lie January 6th insurrectionists? All of these groups are very happy to embrace violence. We see it every day. It's getting pretty scary now. The anti-vax and anti-mask crowd, the COVID's our best friend bunch, it's getting more and more violent. And you can see an overlay. The Venn diagram is starting to get pretty fat between the crazy right, the alt-right, QAnon, the big lie folks, and the anti-vax, anti-mask crowd. We're starting to see this overlap. And if they really join forces, and if violence becomes more than just an anecdotal thing on the news, where, we've seen school boards in Arkansas, people shouting and threatening. There was one scene we saw in the video where they're trying to leave and they're stopping their cars and they're shouting at them, "We know where you live," and they're getting death threats. I mean, Dr. Fauci himself has gotten just, you can't even count anymore the death threats that he gets on a daily basis. So yeah, don't both sides me on this. There is no violence on the left. The closest thing you can point to is, and you and I have talked about this a little bit, the closest thing you can point to is the Antifa philosophy. And again, Antifa is not a group by any stretch of the imagination. You can't call it a group or an organization. Antifa is an idea. And on the left, we were debating with ourselves, out of the earshot of pretty much everybody else. This was only within the community of the left. We were debating a couple years ago, well, is it okay to punch a Nazi? Basically, that was the extent of the conversation. Antifa, the idea of Antifa, and those who supported it, were arguing that, yes, we have to go to places like Charlottesville. We have to go to these neo-Nazi rallies, and we don't have to start fights. We're not going to gun them down or even to beat them up, but we are going to counter-protest, which, of course, every American has the right to do. Everyone, even the craziest right-winger, has the right to protest, and I'll never say otherwise. But equally, and just as importantly, counter-protesters have a right to be there. And you can shout each other down, and that's just the way America works. Well, the Antifa folks were putting forth the argument, again, this argument happening within those of us on the left. We're going to come to these events, these protests. We're going to protect counter-protesters. And yes, it's perfectly legitimate to be ready for violence. If the Proud Boys, if the alt-right, if the KKK, if the neo-Nazis are going to employ violence, we will be ready. So that's what Antifa was about. And there was a great debate on the left. Many of us, I joined in some of these myself, these debates. Many of us were saying, no, violence is never the way. We are committed to nonviolence. Well, isn't it okay to punch a Nazi? I don't know. Even the most devoted nonviolent folks among us, had to think about that. It really ought to be okay to punch a Nazi. We almost universally agree, I think it's hard to find anybody who disagrees, that our dads and our grandpas who went to fight World War II, went to fight Hitler, that's the very essence of anti-fascism, Antifa. They were heroes. And to this day, historically, it's a 100% consensus that they did the right thing. Yeah, you meet violence with violence on the battlefield, and you defeat Hitler and his forces. Yes, it's okay to shoot a Nazi. Yes, it's okay to punch a Nazi. That's anti-fascism. That's Antifa. Well, now you bring this into the modern setting, and now it's not the beaches of Normandy or the battlefields of France. No, it's a bunch of people on a street in Charlottesville. What are the rules of engagement here? Even though I kept advocating for nonviolence, it's a legitimate debate to have. Well, if the neo-Nazis start swinging clubs, what do? Just take it? This is still, to this day, an unsettled question. How are we to respond? But I bring all this up only to say there is no way in living hell that any right-thinking person can compare today's left movements, Black Lives Matter, Antifa, etc., to today's far-right movements, QAnon, Proud Boys, Three Percenters, militias, etc. There is no comparison. None. So don't even try it. Don't go there with me. Let me give credit. The article I was reading was by Kat Stafford, Associate Press National Race and Ethnicity writer. She closes this way. Micaiah Green, a liberation organizer and co-conductor of the Washington, D.C.-based group Harriet's Wildest Dreams, fully supports the report's findings and calls for action. Again, the report we're talking about finds that BLM and its allies were nonviolent, and not only that, they were surveilled and actively pursued, oppressed by federal intelligence, FBI, etc. Green believes President Joe Biden needs to fulfill his campaign pledge of supporting Black Americans and addressing the root cause of white supremacy by pushing for amnesty for protesters. Green said Congress also needs to support legislation to overhaul the criminal justice system. Regardless of how we are often painted, activists are people who have the audacity to believe that we can live in a better world, where people are safe, where people are not afraid of being murdered by the police, Green said. There are attempts to stifle our movement, but it is truly a reflection to our supporters, to our allies, and to the folks who showed up in the streets last year of how beautiful and powerful this movement is. All right, just wanted to share that with you. And once again, if don't try both sidesing this with me. Nope. That ain't never going to fly. Well, let's see. Speaking of suppression, people in Wisconsin, please take note. 205,000 Wisconsin voter registrations deactivated. Reading now from The Hill. Voter registrations for more than 205,000 Wisconsin residents have been deactivated after a routine effort by the state to keep voter rolls up to date. The Hill is kind of conservative, so they call it a routine effort. Deactivating voter registrations in Wisconsin is a routine practice required by law every 2 years, as part of the state's voter record maintenance, according to the Wisconsin Elections Commission. The effort identifies individuals who have not voted in the previous 4 years and deactivates their registrations unless they want to remain on voter rolls. The practice of removing voters from rolls in Wisconsin has been a topic of debate in the state. Conservatives filed a lawsuit in 2019 asking the commission to purge voters from rolls if they did not reply to mailings within 30 days, according to the Associated Press. The legal action, however, ultimately failed. Yeah, like I say, The Hill is a pretty conservative publication. The bottom line here is this is a tried and true and treasured technique by the right wing. They love getting a hold of the voter rolls and finding any excuse in the world to deregister people. The investigative reporter Greg Palast has done incredible work on this issue. And if you want to know about how states and municipalities go about purging voters from their rolls, check out the work of Greg Palast. Whenever I recommend him, I always give you a little warning. He has this stupid persona. Don't let that throw you. He wears a fedora and a trench coat, and he has this old film noir private eye kind of image for himself. I don't know why he does it. It's dumb. So I'm just warning you, get past that. His investigative reporting is really good. It's in-depth. It's totally legit. He's written for large publications. He's worked for the BBC. He's a real guy. He's not a nutcase. When you see if you go to his website, you'll look at it and think, what is this guy? I don't know why. I don't know why he does the stupid noir private dick kind of thing. I just want to tell you, his reporting is legit. And he's really the go-to guy for these kinds of stories. So wherever you are, Wisconsin or any other state, I just recommend that you always keep a close eye on your registration. Check in, go online, make a phone call, whatever you need to do. Make sure you're registered. Make sure you have all your ducks in a row. We're still a year away from the midterms, but there's always something coming up. There are local elections, there are primaries, there are special elections. You just always want to be on top of your game when it comes to voting. So they're out there. And especially in the red states or even the purple states like Wisconsin, we have a Democratic governor, but we have a Republican legislature. And of course, as we've been talking about here on the log, in places like Georgia, the Republican state legislature has now usurped their election commissions, both state and local, and they've basically taken over elections. These are the kind of things that happen between elections that we have to keep an eye on. And if they have some success, obviously the Stacey Abrams of the world are doing what they can. You have to join forces with them. But just for your own personal vote, for your own individual vote, take the extra steps necessary to make sure everything is in order. You got whatever ID they need, you're registered, you're answering your mail, whatever it takes, because they're going after you. If you're someone who has a history of voting Democratic or left, if you're a person of color, if you have a name that sounds like you're a person of color, they are after you. You got to know that they're after you. So, with that warning. And then one last story, somewhat related to this. I talked earlier about how the fringe and the weirdos and the militias and the QAnon, all of that, they're out on the streets and they're online doing the most outrageous things, but they have allies in Congress, in the House, in the Senate, in the White House for 4 years with the Orange Menace. And certainly in state legislatures, they have allies that can really get things done. Okay? Just like the January 6th insurrectionists. They had allies on that very day in the halls of Congress doing the legal side of the job, right? They're doing the institutional work. But they're all on the same page. Some of them are doing crazy violent shit out on the streets, and others are using their high office, as high as U.S. Senator, to accomplish the same goals within the halls of power. Well, I bring this up because of a recent headline I saw. The January 6th Select Panel takes over House probe of the Orange Menace DOJ. Of course, we've been hearing a lot of stories, a lot of, good investigative reporting, telling us how perilously close we came to the Orange Menace succeeding in stealing the last election. If he had had the cooperation he was seeking from, for example, the Secretary of State in Georgia, or in this specific case, from his own Department of Justice, thank God they didn't do what he was asking. He was basically asking them to cheat, to steal the election. And not to keep harping on Georgia, but they're such a poster child for this. They have now passed laws in Georgia that would have enabled the Orange Menace to do what he wanted at the time. The only reason he didn't succeed with the Secretary of State in Georgia was because he was asking them to do something that was against state law. He wanted them to finagle the results of the election, but they couldn't do it because it was against Georgia state law. Well, now the very things he was asking them to do are now legal. So if they want to do it in future elections, they can. And as I say, if the DOJ, if the Orange Menace's own DOJ had been more cooperative, we might still be living under the Orange Menace regime. Well, I bring this all up because I think this is an important little item. Reading now from Politico. A key House committee has postponed multiple scheduled witness interviews about Donald Trump's final day in office, handing them off to the select panel investigating the January 6th Capitol attack. As the Oversight Committee continues its crucial oversight work, we look forward to the Select Committee fully exposing the former president's unconstitutional attacks on our democracy and attempts to stay in power after the American people voted him out of office, House Oversight Committee Chair Representative Carolyn Maloney, Democrat of New York, said in a statement to Politico on Thursday. So I just was happy to see that headline. I wanted to give you a little happy news for the end of the show here. Yes, it's completely appropriate, and I'm so glad that that they see this, that the January 6th committee is not just about the QAnon shaman and testosterone-fueled wackos beating up Capitol Police with American flags. Yes, it's about that. But it must also be about the maneuverings of the Orange Menace and his allies in the Department of Justice. He did have some. Thankfully, they didn't succeed. His allies in the House, his allies in the Senate. Everything he was doing institutionally. Again, you have to have this partnership. You have to have the crazies on the streets. You have to have the fringe radicals. And you have to have those in seats of power within the halls of power on your side. It takes both. And for the January 6th committee to look at both sides of this coin is absolutely crucial. And I'm so glad that they understand that and that they're doing it. All right. Well, it looks like that's the time we have for today. A reminder that this episode is available right now on YouTube, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, anywhere you find your podcasts. Go ahead and look for that. When you do, search Charles Bursell in the search window. I love hearing from you. Please do go to the Facebook page or to charlesbursell.com and say hello. Give me your comments and thoughts on anything we talk about on the show, or anything else for that matter. Thanks very much to our terrestrial flagship station, River West Radio, riverwestradio.com. Our theme song composed and performed by Peter Donalds. All right, thanks for listening. I love you. I'm Charles Bursell.